So you might be asking yourself, what is behavioral neuroscience? Well, in essence, behavioral neuroscience is the study of the nervous system and behavior. So we look at the relationship between our behavior and our brain, very simply put. And we're really interested in how the brain, right, influences behavior, but also the body, right? Because the body sends messages back to the brain and the brain sends messages back to the body, and we look at that relationship. The other thing you might hear is biopsychology, psychobiology, right? So you'll hear all these terms thrown around. Physiological psychology, these are all, right, behavioral neuroscience. They just go under different names. So you might be wondering, what kinds of behaviors do neuroscientists study? Well, that's a great question, and there's a lot, but some are what changes in the brain when a person learns. So we'll talk about how when neurons fire together, they wire together. So what does these rewiring of these neurological connections look like? Because your neurons are constantly changing all the time. Listening to my lecture, your neurons, your neural connections will be different by the time I finish the sentence from before I started the sentence. The other thing that's fascinating, a lot of students get really interested in this, is what is the relationship between your physiological state and your emotions, right? What is that connection? How can we use our biology to explain our emotions? And we can. The other question that we'll try to answer is, what is consciousness? Now, this is the million-dollar question. This is the hard problem of consciousness. So everybody can I get an idea if I ask you, what does it mean to be conscious? But I think a lot of students don't, even researchers, top researchers in the field, it's very hard to define what is involved with consciousness. So we could describe it like being aware of yourself and your environment, but what are the components in the brain that lead to consciousness? And we'll talk about these things and some others. So there is a mind-brain problem. And early researchers, right, would argue that the mind and the body are composed of the same substance. It's monism. And they'd say, okay, well, they're a single substance, and some would be idealistic, and they'd say it's all non-physical, and some would be materialistic, right? And they'd say it's all physical. So it's either non-physical or all physical. And then there's dualism. And some researchers and argue that the mind and the brain are separate. So the brain is the material, the mind is the non-material. So this is that mind-brain problem that we'll be kind of teasing apart in this class. The other thing I want to talk about when we talk about the origins of neuroscience is models. Now, models are proposed mechanisms for how something works. So if you've taken a neuroscience class, you'll have an idea of what a model is. And one of the famous early researchers, well, I want to use the word researcher very loosely here, but one of the early theorists, I should say, philosophers, that's a better term, philosophers, is Descartes. And he had something called the hydraulic model. And he thought that there's basically animal spirits were pumped through the brain, through the pineal gland. And he called the pineal gland the seat of the soul. And this model, unfortunately, was not supported by empiricism. And all we mean by empiricism is learning through or gathering information through observation, right? That's all empiricism is. So if you remember back to your high school days when they talk about empirical evidence, that's just through observation, gathering data. And it could be experimentation too. But unfortunately, neither of these were supported because we'll get into it. But the pineal gland is not the seat of the soul, and there's not hydraulic fluids being pumped into the body. But if we move forward in history a little bit, we have Wilhelm Wundt, that's a tough name to say, and he founded the first psychological laboratory in Germany in 1879. And we will go into more detail about that. But this is when the modern field of psychology really took off, was in 1879 with Wilhelm Wundt. And here's just a picture of Descartes' model. He imagined that there was these fluids that would run through the body, kind of like a statue. That's kind of where he got the idea. But we know today that this is not the case, right? There is not hydraulics running through our bodies. Another famous researcher who really brought about changes in behavioral neuroscience was Helmholtz, and excuse me if I pronounce his name wrong, and if I said it wrong, you can leave comments in the bottom. He built off the work showing that the nerves operated by electricity. So now we're moving away from this hydraulic fluid, but now we're thinking, okay, how does the brain work? And it actually works through electricity. And he demonstrated, though, that it's not a one-to-one comparison. He demonstrated that the conduction in the brain is slower than copper wires. That's interesting. The reason why his research is so important is because he established the biological nature of neural connections, right? He realized that, wait a minute, there's something going on here with neurological communication. There's something biological. And he really opened the door to study neurons scientifically. So now we're going to get into empirical research. And he was around, by the way, from 1821 to 1894. Other famous researchers that you will read about in famous studies when we talk about localization in the brain. If you guys remember back to your Psych 100 days and Phineas Gage, who got a tampering iron rod through his frontal lobe. He survived, but it impaired his social behavior. He wasn't as nice of a person. He was meaner and not as friendly. Another important area about localization in the brain and how specific areas control behavior. So that frontal cortex, we realized it controls our social behaviors. So Phineas Gage had an issue with that. Another interesting case study, we'll call it, which they were case studies, was about Broca and Broca's patient. So there was a man with the inability to say anything other than the word tan. And after he passed away, they did an autopsy, and they realized that there was an area damaged in his left frontal lobe, and we call that now Broca's area, but we realized that's involved with speech. So brain processing is localized, right? But always be cautious, right? Because there's also pseudoscience. Well, there was pseudoscience out there, and there still is to some extent, which was phrenology. And phrenologists would argue that you could look at people's bumps on their head to get an idea about their personalities and their intelligence, basically. You can get an idea about their faculties. This was all BS. This was not true. It was pseudoscience, and it was done away with. But it was in a magazine. So be careful, and we'll talk about what's science and what's pseudoscience a little bit later on. And then Lashley had a theory called equal potentiality, and he really looked at the brain, and he kind of differentiated away from localization. He said that, yeah, there are some localized to certain areas, like certain functions, but some areas are undifferentiated in the brain, that some areas can take over other parts of the brain. So he did this with lesioning rats. Most of his work now has been defunct, but the good point is that we get an idea that there is localization and there is generalization in the brain. So it's not one way or the other. And as I was saying, current research shows that there is localization and distribution of functioning. So we'll talk about how different areas of the brain, right? So there's Broca's areas for speech, there's a part of your cortex for movement, and there's another part for body sensations. And we could talk about Wernicke's area, which is for listening comprehension. And then there's an area for Broca's area, which is speech comprehension. Then we have the audio cortex for hearing, and we have your occipital lobe for vision. So there is both localization and distribution of functions. And we'll go into more detail as we move through this semester.